welcome everybody to our lecture over the internal decisions tables. We will be talking about the following. We're going to understand what the internal decisions tables are and their data types. We're going to understand the commonly used tables, and then we're going to talk about why they are used. So pretty simple. Understand that decisions has internal data types, how we use it, and why. Alrighty, so the first thing we're going to understand is in this project specifically, there are many types of internal decisions data types, ranging from the account data type to the groups data type, and it can go, and there's many other ones. The main two that you will want to remember for this project are element registration and entity folders. These are commonly used tables for displaying designer elements to specific users. I've been on calls with many clients where they want to build like a specific kind of rule dashboard for their rule auditing users where they can say, I want to look at all the rules that they've created and I want those rule auditors to have access to that dashboard. Well, we accomplish this task by utilizing the element registration table and filtering out all of the designer elements that are in a specific entity folder. And when we do that, we are able to section off only parts of the designer elements that are used in production or in designing by applying a folder filter to the element registration table. And then that leads into the entity folder internal decisions data type. In decisions, there is this folder data type. Everything you see in decisions is a folder of some sort. You have designer folders and normal folders. Those are the base two that we understand when we first started learning decisions. But decisions has a lot of different types of folder behaviors where when you create them, they're just different folders. A great example of this is rule sets. If you do a conditional rule set and you put a rule set underneath another rule set, you're essentially just creating a folder that's of the rule set type behavior. That's essentially what it is. So that's why the entity folder data structure is very paramount to understand because literally everything's a folder in decisions, almost everything. All right. Now that we talked about that a little bit more, how are these tables used? So why is this relevant information to know, right? Going back into that why. So anytime you hear the phrase that, hey, this is stored as a database table in decisions, you have to think two things. The first thing you have to think is, oh, wait, I can actually report over those tables. So for example, with the analogy that I talked about earlier, or the example I talked about earlier, about showing the designer elements that a certain user created, well, I can create a dashboard for them and filter out the created by property of that element registration designer element and say, hey, filter out all of the designer elements that Jared created. And then the report will only show the designer elements that I've created. Also, because they are database tables, you can use things like a fetch entity step or use a create data step. And what you can do is you can create variables of that data type of element registration or entity folder. And you can fetch those and you can say, hey, I want to get all the designer elements that Jared created. And that's just referencing this internal decisions data type called element registration. Right now, there is an inherent relationship between those two folders, right? Everything I talked about in the last slide applies to folders as well. So you can fetch entities of the folder decisions data type. You can also report over the folder data type in decisions. Now, we're going to transition and talk about this inherent relationship between the two. Now, because every designer element lives in a folder, right? You create a designer folder called Jared's Designer Elements. Inside of it contains Flow 1, Flow 2, Rule 1, Rule 2, right? And that folder, Jared's Designer Elements, is storing those element registrations. So what you can do is you can actually add a decisions relationship between those two tables and say, hey, I'm going to define the folder ID and filter out every single designer element that is a part of this entity folder ID. What that does is it will parameterize your designer elements to say only show elements contained with this specific folder. And that's why it's useful. And it does this because in the element registrations table, there is a property called entity folder ID. What that entity folder ID means is it's the folder ID, it's the field that stores the folder ID of where that designer element lives in the decisions environment. And that's why it's important. Because later on in the document routing project, we'll actually have you fetch all of the designer elements or flows that are inside of the runtime designer folder. And then you can display those flows on a form to allow people to add additional routes. So that's how that works, and that's why it's critical and important. So why we use it, right? So for example, they fed two reasons. One, like I talked about earlier, it allows you to create this kind of folder-driven design for scalability, where you can say, hey, I want to only fetch designer elements located in this folder. Then because of those folders, you can put permissions on those folders and say, hey, only certain users can view those elements because you can put permissions on the folder where those designer elements reside. So that's the application here. How it applies directly to the document route project is notice that in document data, we have a list of folders for discarded, invoice, resume, and unclassified. So in regards to the entity folder, you will have to create a report over the folder, the decisions folder data type, and then you want to filter it and say, hey, I want to show only the items that are contained within the invoice folder. And that would be a filter you apply on that report. So that's how it's used. I'll show that in a little bit. Then also for the fetch entity step, it has this parent folder ID, which means that you can say, hey, I want to fetch all of the objects of this data type that are stored within this folder. And you can set that parent folder ID to a constant to select from flow, to have a dynamic fetching of things in different folders, or you can leave it as a constant to fetch all the data from the same folder. All right, so that's a little complex, but I'm going to try to demonstrate this and show you how we've configured this in the system. So in my document data, I've created 4 normal folders, right? Discarded, invoice, resume, and unclassified. But you'll notice I'm answering the question in regards to how does the entity folder data structure apply to the setup. It applies because in the manager dashboard, I have different tabs displaying the contents of these folders in the dashboard. So an end user who sees this will not know that, oh, this is actually a folder. All they're going to see is that this dashboard displays data to them. They have no idea how it does this. It just displays invoice, resumes, and they can click through the tabs and say, okay, I can see the different documents and I can perform the necessary action I want on those documents. So now, what does that mean though? How did we set this up? So how we set this up is what we did is I'm going to go ahead and flip back into the studio and show you the data types of the reports. I'm going to show you one of them because all of the other ones are the same. It's just a different filter. So if I'm going to go into the invoices in folder report, notice that I'm reporting over the document data source because everything deals with the document. So that's what we have to understand. But what I can do is I could apply a 4-folder filter and say, hey, I want to select the invoice folder. So since this report is always looking at that invoice folder, it doesn't matter. I'm going to show this in the folder tree. It doesn't matter how many documents I put in the invoice folder because it's selected. If the process identifies a new invoice, then it's going to display that additional document because it got placed in that folder. This data is modified by more things being added to that normal folder. Now this setup, right? So right here, this data source and this filter is the same across all of those report views that you saw on the dashboard. The only thing that has changed is the 4-folder filter and then the folder it's looking at. So that's all that you will have to do for this dashboard. That's how it is made, right? We have an unclassified folder, we have a discarded folder, and then here we just have all documents that reports over the document data for all of them. So that's how it works. All it's doing is it's just saying, let's report over the document data source. And then after we report over the document data source, then all we have to do is apply a 4-filter to that. So that's how we're using it. The other thing that that's going to be relevant is when we add additional document routes. So for example, the other way we use it is I also have in my flows folder a runtime flows. Now what this does is it allows me to say, hey, I want to add more document routes here. And let's say I created a new route. And I'm going to call this the let's do legal documents, right? I'm going to create a new route for legal documents. So I'm going to create this flow. It's not going to do anything intelligent. And for those watching in regard to building the project, you won't have to build this flow. I'm merely utilizing this to illustrate the process that you will build in the project. So I'm going to close and save this. Now remember, the external data truth table only displays the values of flows that are already stored in that database structure. Remember, legal documents isn't stored in that external database structure, at least not yet. So let's say I had a dev team that created legal documents and imagine it did something intelligent. And so let's say I want to store another type of document folder. And if I want to do that, all I have to do now with my add additional route is I can add it here. I can select from flow and notice it only shows the legal documents flow. The reason why is because I created a filter on this form, which I will show you, that only fetches the data that only fetches the designer elements that are not already stored inside the runtime external truth table database structure. So now what I could say is like, hey, this is a legal document. I can say if I want to store it in any of the existing documents. So if I want to put it in invoice, unclassified, resume, or discarded, or let's say it's a new type of document. And then I'm going to say this is the, legal document, right? And then when I click done, it's going to run. And then you'll see I have a legal documents folder already created in my document data. And so now if I want to add documents in my route, and let's say my Azure storage contains a document that says contains legal, then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to pass in that data, store it here in this legal documents folder. Another cool thing that you'll want to see is when I go into the rules and I edit my truth table, you will see that now I have a new route for legal documents, the folder ID, and its classification. So I can have all that information there, and I can then send it to the appropriate place that it's needed for routing. So I have a dynamically scalable process. All right, so now let's go into the form and let's see how I built that specific add additional route. So we're going to go into the add additional document route so you can see what I've done here. So what I've done is, right, if the user creates the process here for a new type of document, then it's going to say, hey, create the subfolder, and then create the new document folder name, which is from a variable coming from the form, and then create that record in the external truth table. And then once we do that, boom, then we're done. Now, how did I do the filtering for that runtime flow storage? Well, I used a thing called an active form flow, and I'm going to show you that active form flow. So this flow right here, this drop-down list is of the type element registration, right? We talked about that earlier. So I created a drop-down list to look at the element registration. And once I did that, I created an active form flow that says, hey, fetch the flows in the document routing project. So let's look at this one. And then when I edit this flow, you will see that upon startup, right, I am fetching all the results in the internal truth table, right? So I'm fetching all that stuff. Then I'm fetching all the results from the element registration where hidden equals false because I want only the enabled non-hidden flows. And then I'm saying, hey, I want to filter out all of the flows that are in the list of the external truth table all flow ID. So I'm checking to see if any of the flows inside that folder are already written inside of that external truth table data structure. If they are, then what I'm doing is I want to then display the ones that do not match so that I can say that, hey, these are the ones that need to be promoted for the route. And then once I do that, and once it finds any, it will display that data. And so that's how we've done that specific setup for the external truth table for adding an additional route. When I go to the type of document, right, this shows you, this is of the decisions folder data type, which we talked about earlier. And this shows all of the different folders for the project. So if I go to active form flows again, fetch folder names for type, and just to show you this active form flow, right? All I did is I said, hey, fetch all of the folder IDs, fetch all the folders that are in document data, right? I don't need a filter for the folder ID at all because it's not needed, so I can delete this and be okay. Because the only thing I need to do is I just need to say fetch all the folders that are contained within document data. And therefore, once I do that, it automatically shows the particular property that is needed. And it will display just those 4 or now 5 folders because I've added legal documents into the process. So that's how that process works. It's pretty simple. The only complex part is just understanding that you can leverage those internal decisions data types to create a scalable process that builds designer elements for you. And that's the power of what this project shows you, is that you can create decisions to build itself so that if you have a new route you want to add, you don't need to create some long process that promotes it. You just have to have a flow that you can give permissions to that only certain users have access, and then it could add new folders for you, and it can add a new route in your truth table. So that's the power of understanding the element registration table and the entity underscore folder table and how to leverage it and use it for this project in regard to additional routes. Thank you for watching. That concludes our lecture over internal decisions data types.